Today, I'm going to initiate a discussion on reforming the United Nations. How the United Nations can be amended and what kind of the amendments are required. This is a burning issue. It is at the top agenda of the world community, at the United Nations as well. Dear students, I think it is also the concern of all of you. It is my concern, it is the concern of India, and it is the concern of the whole community of states, the people at large. I am Iqbalur Rahman. I welcome you in this lecture. I teach political science in the Department of Political Science of Aligarh Muslim University. I think this is important for you to understand that what reforms actually are required, how those reforms could be made. So in order to understand, we have to understand what kind of the mechanism the UN Charter has laid down for the reformation of the United Nations, for introducing amendments into the Charter of the United Nations. So, reforming the UN is an overdue issue. No system, my dear students, no institution ever created has proved successful functional system in all situations for all time to come. They need to evolve. They need to make themselves proficient and suitable according to the changed realities which they face and which they have to deal with. Like any other institution, the United Nations itself requires the reformation. United Nations reflects the reality of the time of its creation when it was created in 1945. After about 8 decades of its evolution, its creation, it largely continues to reflect the international order which was created by the victorious powers of the Second World War. The undeniable reality today is that outside the United Nations, much has undergone change. The world today does not reflect the order which was created in the post-Second World War. To address this change, dear students, the United Nations has to change itself in order to be viable, in order to survive, and in order to progress. With all its shortcomings, the United Nations continues to remain an indispensable stabilizing force and cornerstone of international system. Replacing the United Nations is not an option, dear students, or any proposition by any member of the UN to replace it, to do away with it. But the fact is that failure to reform could imperil its enduring strength of legitimacy and globalism. There is perception among the UN members, particularly about the UNSC's perceived illegitimacy, which could cause non compliance with its resolutions, letting the United Nations face fate of the bygone League of the United Nations would be unacceptable. It would be acceptable. It would be unacceptable that it should meet the fate of the League of Nations. The world of the 21st century desperately needs a healthy multilateral United Nations that is grounded, capable of advancing global peace. Achieving that result requires adopting the United Nations according to the new global realities it faces today. The reforming the United Nations is unquestionably an undeniable reality we cannot overlook. UN cannot overlook it. The word community cannot overlook. The Charter of the United Nations provides a very cumbersome mechanism for the reform, amendment of the UN Charter. This is what we need to understand, what is provided in the UN Charter to make changes in the UN Charter itself. There are two provisions in the UN Charter, Article 108 and 109, which lay down the mechanism how amendments can be enacted. Article 108 says that amendments to the present charter shall come into force for all members of the United Nations when they have been adopted by a vote of 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly and ratified in accordance with their respective constitutional processes by 2/3 of the members of the United Nations, including all the permanent members of the Security Council. Article 109 provides for the reform. Part 1 of the article says that a general conference of the members of the United Nations for a purpose of reviewing the present charter may be held at a date and place to be fixed by 2/3 vote of the members of the General Assembly and by a vote of any 9 members of the Security Council. Each member of the United Nations shall have 1 vote in the conference. The second part of the same article says that any alteration of the present charter recommended by a 2/3 vote of conference shall take effect when ratified in accordance with their respective constitutional processes by 2/3 of the members of the United Nations, including all permanent members of the Security Council. Part 3 of the article says that if such a conference has not been held before the 10th annual session of the General Assembly, following the coming into force of the present charter, the proposal to call such a conference, dear student, shall be placed on the agenda of that session of the General Assembly, and the conference shall be held if so decided by a majority vote of the members of the General Assembly and a vote of any 9 members of the Security Council. The laid down amendment procedure is very cumbersome, as I said. We try to look at the picture, what it entails. This is essential. According to Article 8, the Charter amendments require the consent of all 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, defined in Article 23 of the Charter. It is impossible to cause Charter amendments without their consent. No concept of them, no amendment. Many reformers describe this situation as a catch-22. This is the reality of the fact that the UN represents dynamics of the victorious nations of the Second World War, towards which they appear to be upholding this reality. Article 109 provides for the convening of a general conference of the members of the United Nations to consider amendments. No veto right would apply in this case of this article. Article 109, dear student, was not part of the United Nations original blueprint. USA, Soviet Union and the United Kingdom were in disagreement to this provision. At the San Francisco Conference of 1945, a smaller state expressed their opposition, discontentment to the Security Council composition and veto privilege of the 5 permanent members. This article was introduced as a compromise according to which the Charter and the Security Council would be subject to change and democratization at later age, at later time. The Charter Amendment procedure according to Article 108 is another means of introducing changes and reform of the United Nations. Article 109 was designed to facilitate more substantive changes. What I'm saying, I'm emphasizing that it was designed to facilitate more substantive changes. For a new main organ would imply overall changes, and therefore multiple provisions would be affected. For example, the charter sections on the General Assembly and the Security Council. Therefore, the alternate path of Article 109 for a more elaborative and general review conference to adopt such changes was provided for. The outcome of the review conference, once adopted and ratified, becomes binding on all UN members. There are 2 stages in UN Charter review process. First, convening of the conference under Article 109 and adopting the desired changes. And at this stage, 2/3 of the favorable vote of the member state is needed to adopt changes, whereas the 5 permanent members are not able to veto the outcome. What I'm saying, the veto power is exercisable in case of 109. In the second phase, the adopted changes are sent to the member states for ratification. At this stage, the 5 permanent members can, according to the Charter, potentially veto any decision. No ratification means that any amendment, any review which is agreed under Article 109 would fail. This is probably the reason Article 109 procedure has been avoided or not forced. However, the disagreement persists at the 5 permanent can veto the outcome of the Charter. Charter review in practice, once it was held, the Charter is not clear about the duration of the ratification process and what it happens if the 5 permanent member abstains from the ratification, neither adopting nor rejecting of the outcome. The supportive argument relates to Article 109 when the UNSC and the ECOSOC membership were increased. What I'm just putting across before you is that in order to make amendments, Article 109 was not used. The amendments were made through Article 108. When the UNSC and the ECOSOC's memberships were increased in 1960 and 1970, despite 1 or more permanent members opposing the changes, once the ratification process started, they gave in to global political pressures and eventually ratified the changes. This is the argument which is given in support of the Article 109, that once the conference is held and the outcome is produced, so the pressure which it would generate on the 5 permanent members, they would agree to the outcome, to the amendments proposed under Article 109. This is a remote possibility. It could happen, but as we know that this is something which is not exactly we can say is going to happen. The requirement that a proposal to call such a conference shall be placed on the agenda of However, up to now, no charter review conference has held under Article 09 to substantive and legally binding nature of outcome. In 1955, the UN General Assembly established a committee to meet the report to report on this possibility annually. The committee did so until 1967. Afterwards, the committee became irrelevant and non-functional. So, in practical aspect, the Article 109 has lost its utility. Despite the very cumbersome amendment procedure, reforming the UN is the need of the hour and at the top of the UN agenda. The UN members want reforms. What reforms is a question pregnant with disagreement. The issue of the UNSC reform appears to be on the priority. The UNSC, being the defining and the controlling part of the UN, occupies the center stage when it comes to the question of reform. Reform, my dear student, is a holistic issue. Reforming in the United Nations Security Council would not make the UN viably vibrant as we expect it to be. Reforming is to be taken as a package deal to take up the issues of various levels like administrative reforms, programmatic reforms, financial reforms, and structural reforms. A history of reforms, I think in brief we need to talk about here, just to give you a sense that what in the past United Nations had made amendment to its charters. The amendment to Article 23 enlarges the membership of the Security Council from 11 to 15. The amendment of Article 27 provides the decision of the Security Council on procedural matters shall be made by an affirmative vote of 9 members and all other matters by an affirmative vote of 9 members, including the concurring votes of 5 permanent members of Security Council. The amendment to Article 61, which entered into force on 31 August 1965, enlarged the membership of the Economic and Social Council from 18 to 20. The subsequent amendment to that article, which entered into force on 24 September 1973, further increased the membership of the Council from 27 to 54. There have been only 5 amendments to the UN Charter since 1945, and none of them were done through the Article 109, reflecting the increase in the UN membership, which has almost became universal. Amendments to the Article 23, 27 and 61 of the Charter were adopted by the General Assembly on 17 December 1963 and came into force on 31 August 1965. A further amendment to Article 61 was adopted by the General Assembly on 20 December 1971 and came into force on 24 September 1973. An amendment to Article 109 adopted by the General Assembly on 20 December 1965 came into force on 12 June 1968. The amendment to Article 109, which related to the first paragraph of the article, provides that a general conference of the members for the purpose of reviewing the Charter may be held at a time and place to be fixed by 2/3 of the vote of the members of the General Assembly and by a vote of any 9 members, which was formerly 7 of the Security Council. This was the amendment. These were the amendments which were adopted. Besides 5 amendments, some structural changes were also adopted without amendment. Some changes to the Charter defined the structure of the United Nations have also been made without formal amendment to the text. These changes were, my dear students, were made without making any amendment in the Charter of the United Nations. One is the requirement in Article 27 that the decision of the Security Council on all other matters not procedural shall be made by an affirmative vote of 9 members, including the concurring votes of the permanent members, has been reinterpreted in practice to include abstentions within the definition of concurring votes. The Soviet Union's permanent seat in the UN Security Council was assumed by Russia after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The third case is the Taipei case. The Taipei-based Republic of China, that is Taiwan today, enjoyed the permanent seat in the Security Council. That seat was assumed by the Beijing, the People's Republic of China, when the General Assembly adopted Resolution 2758. So these changes were made without attempting any amendment in the Charter. As I said, my dear students, that the UN has provided a system of amendment which relates to the reformation of the United Nations. This gives us a picture. This gives us a picture where we see that any kind of the reform, any kind of the amendment has to be consented by all the 5 permanent members. On this very ground, what is said is that the UN reflects the post-Second World War order which the victorious powers has created, and they continue to uphold it. They don't wish to dilute the power structure where they dominate, where they control, where they decide to be given up. So, the reforms of the United Nations have to be looked upon, analyzed, seen that how the United Nations Charter was made and how the amendment procedure was made cumbersome. As I said, that Article 109 was not actually at the agenda of the San Francisco Conference. Looking at the blueprint which was prepared at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, the smaller states dissented, and as I said, as a compromise, this Article 109 was made just to give them in hope that after due course of 10 years, there would be a possibility that the United Nations would take up the issue of analyzing the functioning of the United Nations, the functioning of the United Nations Charter, and accordingly, the amendments will be proposed and they would be accepted. By introducing one provision, there is no veto involved into Article 109, but by simply introducing one provision that whatever is accepted, in case, under the possibility that if ever any general conference is organized, that requires the ratification by all, including the 5 permanent members. And when the 5 permanent members, they are not in agreement, there would be no possibility that the reforms could be carried out. Despite that we all want that the UN requires amendment, requires to change itself to meet the reality of the present day world. For today, this is all my students, and the purpose today was to deliberate about how United Nations has laid down the provisions for amendment and how in the past it has made amendments and why the Article 109 was not taken up and no efforts were made through this article to just look at to analyze at the United Nations overall functioning, overall relevance, overall working in the due course of its progress. So I think this has given you a kind of a sense where you are in a position to decide how it is difficult to make amendments in the UN Charter. Despite this fact, hopes are not lost. That is all. Thank you.